Hi guys, it's Mr. G. We're back at it again with American traditions, and today we're talking about turmoil in England. So when it comes to colonial America, one of the things that we rarely talk about is the impact that the English Civil War had on the colonies. See, there had been an ongoing conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism in England. See, here's the thing. When King Henry VIII created the Anglican Church, in doing so, he alienated a lot of Catholics who were loyal to the Catholic Church. And so when Queen Elizabeth came in and succeeded her father, she established Protestantism as the official religion. This caused some friction with her family in Scotland, who were still Catholic, as well as others, most notably the Spanish, who felt that she was illegitimate and a heretic for not being a Catholic herself. When she died, because she had no children, the throne went to her cousin James of Scotland. And when James died, he eventually left his son Charles to ascend to the throne. Now, Charles is an interesting character because throughout his reign, albeit a bit shortened, Charles I felt that kings had a divine right to rule. This absolutism of monarchy was a very common idea at the time. He basically felt that Parliament was beneath him, that Parliament was a relic of the past, and that he didn't really need to consult with Parliament when it came to operating as King of England. So as you can imagine, Parliament was kind of irked, and in fact, Charles would go on to dismiss Parliament from time to time and really downplay their power. Charles also ruffled some feathers when he reformed the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, to be more like the Catholic Church. And so for the Catholics, it felt like he wasn't going far enough and that he ought to convert to Catholicism. For the Protestants, it felt like he was flirting too much with the Catholic Church and sort of undoing some of the Protestantism that had been put in place by Elizabeth. And so this really drove off. We see many Puritans flock to the Americas in search of religious and political freedom, right? Because Charles I didn't play nice with Parliament, this would lead to some increased tensions. The thing is, if you are going to piss off your Parliament, you shouldn't have to go up to them and ask them to raise taxes for you. See, after running up war debts, Charles I asked Parliament to raise taxes for him. When they refused, he dismissed Parliament again. And this really sparked dissent. For the people who felt that Parliament was their representation in government, they felt that their representation was being quashed, and somewhat rightly so. And so in 1640, civil war broke out in England, and the two sides were the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. The Cavaliers, loyal to the king, fought to maintain the monarchy, whereas the Roundheads were loyal to Parliament. They sought to develop a parliamentary system with a limited monarch. Well, the English Civil War was brutal. Parliament and the Roundheads eventually proved victorious. They defeated the Cavaliers, and this was mostly due to Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was not necessarily very liked by his contemporaries, but he was a military genius. And so when Cromwell won the war, he had Charles executed, and eventually, after trying to rule with Parliament for some time, pulled a Charles and disbanded them after they refused to do his bidding. So let me get this straight. They fight a civil war because the king doesn't want to listen to Parliament. They get a guy who kills the king, installs himself as dictator, and then dissolves Parliament because he doesn't want to listen to Parliament. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Everything's fine. And so Cromwell did establish a military dictatorship, and he ruled England until his death. Now, after Cromwell's dictatorship ended, it left a bad taste in people's mouths. His dictatorship was very unpopular with the English and European monarchs alike. European monarchs looked at this and thought, well, this is pretty dangerous stuff, and we see a wave of absolutism sweep across Europe. And so in England, the monarchy is restored after his death. Parliament tried to keep Charles II from succeeding his father, but he ultimately ascended to the throne in 1661. When he died, his brother James II succeeded him. This would be before James II was overthrown. So as you can see, there's a lot of turbulence in the government of England during this time. In 1688, the Glorious Revolution occurs. After infighting between the Catholic Stuarts and the Protestants, a new monarchy is taking hold. You have Mary, who's the daughter of James II, and her husband, William of Orange, overthrowing her father and being installed by Parliament as the new monarchs of England. That's got to be an awkward Thanksgiving. Like, hey Dad, sorry we took your job, it's just I think my husband will be a much better fit for the job. One of the conditions to William and Mary becoming the new King and Queen of England is that they sign on to the English Bill of Rights. This gave some powers to Parliament, which had been the King's, and it limited the scope and the authority of the monarchy. So ultimately, what the English Civil War had set out to do in establishing a limited monarchy and a strong parliamentary system was well on its way to happening. And the Glorious Revolution concludes the English Civil War. And so the aftermath of the English Civil War can be felt not only in England, but across the English Empire. Parliament had destroyed the divine right theory of kingship by anointing William as their king, but it also meant that a greater emphasis was placed on Parliament and representation in government. We see that this is slowly sowing some of the seeds for the American Revolution, for American colonists to call the king illegitimate and to assert that since they do not have representation in Parliament, England has no legitimate claim to govern over the colonies in the Americas. Religion would still be a point of contention, still is today, between England and some of the other parts of the United Kingdom. But it basically would never be a cause for a civil war again. Instead, what we see is a migration of different religious groups to the New World. We also see a birth of new ideas during the English Enlightenment, which followed the English Civil War. One such man with ideas was Thomas Hobbes. So Thomas Hobbes was disturbed by the English Civil War. The chaos that plagued England after Charles's death and during the fighting between the Cavaliers and the Roundheads had really turned him off to the idea of sort of parliamentary government and the idea that men could govern themselves. Hobbes believed that humans are naturally cruel, selfish, and hungry for power. He called life nasty, brutish, and short. And so Hobbes argued that people need to be protected from themselves, basically. You know, I'm simplifying here, but the idea was that only an absolute monarch could maintain order in society. And this is the thesis of his landmark work, Leviathan, in which Thomas Hobbes argues that only a king with absolute power can hold society in check, and that without an absolute monarch, society will eventually degrade into a state of nature where it's a war of all against all. And so Hobbes absolutely felt that the aftermath of the English Civil War, where we ended up with a limited monarchy, was an affront to peace and security within the British Empire. We also get the works of John Locke. Locke had a very different view of the English Civil War. See, he argued that people weren't naturally cruel, selfish, and heartless. He basically argued that every person is born a tabula rasa, a blank slate. And so he believed that we were influenced by our experiences. Basically, he felt that nurture affected us more than our nature. And so in his two treatises of government, he basically says that people are the source of power and that government needs to protect its people. He said, sure, government must protect their people, but not at the expense of their natural rights. It's not just enough to keep law and order for John Locke. John Locke argues that a government has the express purpose and responsibility to protect the rights of citizens. John Locke argued that people were born with the natural rights of life, liberty, and property, among others. And so a lot of people get confused when they hear the difference between property and pursuit of happiness. They say, wait a minute. Why does Thomas Jefferson say we have the right to pursue happiness? Well, you have to understand that in the 1770s, when Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, their idea of happiness is more akin to the Greek theory of eudaimonia, or human flourishing. And so when he says the pursuit of happiness, he's really talking about all the things that make a life worthwhile. And so property is just one of the things that factors into human happiness. And so Thomas Jefferson is really expanding out from property to all the things that lead to a healthy, fruitful life. So as you can imagine, the conflict in England during the Civil War period really led to a diaspora of people. There had been several new colonies set up prior to the English Civil War, and they began to grow greatly during this period of war. Religious tensions in England that led to the Civil War, among other things, also led to people immigrating to these colonies. In fact, Maryland had been founded as a Catholic haven in the New World, and Connecticut and Rhode Island had also been founded for reasons of religious freedom. And so let's go into a little bit more detail. So Maryland was founded in 1632 by Charles I. This area on Chesapeake's Bay had been given primarily for Catholic settlers. Now ultimately, Maryland would have a troubled history when it came to religion. See, when Virginia established Anglicanism as their state religion, many of the Puritans who had landed in Virginia moved their way up towards Maryland. Eventually, Puritans became a majority and set up a new government prohibiting Catholicism until the American Revolution. Connecticut was also a religious haven. Saybrook and New Haven settlements had expanded outward and were eventually merged into the Connecticut colony along with New Haven later on. The Connecticut colony had been founded by Thomas Hooker in 1636, who had left Massachusetts due to overcrowding. As he moved out there and as many more people moved to the area, colonies like New Haven were eventually roped in and Connecticut began to grow. The colony was majority Puritan, and so that meant that as the events of the English Civil War drew on, not only did more Puritans make their way to Connecticut, but they also felt that they were justified in making the choice to leave England, as they saw the religious tension and the all-out war that was breaking out across England. Lastly, the Rhode Island colony, founded by Roger Williams, came in 1636. Roger Williams had been exiled from Massachusetts, and he based the colony on the principle of religious freedom. It was the first colony to establish religious tolerance as a matter of law. Later on, Thomas Jefferson would incorporate some of these ideas, as well as some of John Locke's writings, into the Virginia Declaration of Rights. The colony was also the first to abolish witchcraft trials, debt slavery, and chattel slavery. That being said, the impact of this era was not always rosy in the colonies. The 17th century colonies experienced significant violence that rivaled that of England. The tensions between settlers and Native Americans led to wars like the Pequot War, King Philip's War, and Bacon's Rebellion. In the Pequot War, English Puritans attacked and torched the Pequot village, killing hundreds of people. Likewise, King Philip's War saw its beginnings when 3 Wampanoag men were executed in 1675. King Philip, also known as Metacom, caused widespread destruction across New England. This eventually resulted in a staggering loss of life for the Native Americans and the eradication of their power in the New England area. The dominance of the English settlers in New England would be unchallenged from then on. So as you can see, from Europe to the Americas, the effects of the English Civil War were vast and led to some of the most dynamic changes of the time period. The ideas that came out of the English Enlightenment would go on to affect countries across the world for generations. All right, guys, I hope you found this lesson interesting. Please hit that like button if you haven't. Hit that subscribe button if you're new here. If you haven't already, go ahead and ding that little bell so that way you get all the notifications. It's been great being with you guys. My name's Mr. G, and I'll see you next time.